During Christmas dinner, my uncle pointed at me and laughed. "You'll never have kids. You're too busy chasing money and acting important." My parents nodded and said, "That's why we're leaving the family name to your brother. He's the one who stays." I just smiled and slid the folder across the table. When they opened it and saw I'd just paid off my parents' mortgage, the whole room went silent. I, 34 sat at the Christmas dinner table watching my uncle's face turn red from laughter. The turkey was getting cold, but nobody seemed to care. He was pointing at me across the mashed potatoes, his finger jabbing the air like he was making the world's most important point. He told everyone I'd never have kids because I was too busy chasing money and acting important. The whole table went quiet for a second, then a few nervous chuckles broke out. My aunt looked down at her plate. My cousin pretended to be very interested in the gravy boat. My parents didn't laugh, but they didn't defend me either. My mother just nodded slowly, like my uncle had finally said what everyone had been thinking. My father cleared his throat and added that this was exactly why they were leaving the family name to my brother. "He was the one who stays," my father said. "He was the one who understood what mattered." My brother sat there looking smug, his wife beside him with their 2 kids. The golden child with the perfect family. The one who still lived 20 minutes from our childhood home. The one who showed up for Sunday dinners and remembered birthdays and knew all the neighborhood gossip. I was the one who left. The one who moved 3 states away for college and never came back. The one who built a career instead of building a life here. The one who sent cards instead of showing up. The selfish one. Everyone was staring at me now, waiting for a reaction. Waiting for me to get defensive or angry or hurt. Waiting for me to prove them right about who I was. I just smiled. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a manila folder. I slid it across the table, right past the cranberry sauce and the untouched green bean casserole. It stopped right in front of my father. He looked at me, confused. My mother leaned in. My uncle's laughter had died in his throat. I told my father to open it. The room had gone completely silent. Even the kids had stopped fidgeting. My father's hands shook slightly as he picked up the folder and opened it. I watched his eyes scan the first page. Then the second. His face went pale. My mother grabbed the papers from him. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The folder contained the mortgage payoff documents for their house. Every single penny. Paid in full 3 days ago. The house they'd been struggling with for 28 years. The house they'd almost lost twice during the recession. The house my father had taken a second job to keep. The house that had been bleeding them dry with interest for nearly 3 decades. Gone. Paid off. By me. My mother asked if this was real. Her voice was barely a whisper. I told her it was completely real. The house was theirs, free and clear. No more payments. No more stress. No more lying awake at night wondering if they could afford both the mortgage and my father's medications. My brother's face had gone from smug to confused to something that looked like panic. He asked how I could afford this. There was an edge to his voice, like he was accusing me of something. I explained that this was what happened when you spent 15 years building a career instead of a social life. This was what happened when you worked 80-hour weeks and took every opportunity that came your way. This was what happened when you sacrificed and saved and invested instead of buying the biggest house you could barely afford and the newest truck every 3 years. My uncle had gone very quiet. The man who'd been laughing at me 2 minutes ago was staring at his plate like it contained the secrets of the universe. I wasn't done. I told my parents there was more. Behind the mortgage documents was another set of papers. A trust fund. For their grandchildren. All of their grandchildren. My brother's 2 kids would each get $100,000 for college. Guaranteed. No strings attached. My brother's wife started crying. Not sad crying. Shocked crying. But that wasn't all, I continued. My parents would also find documents for a monthly stipend. $5,000 every month for the rest of their lives. For vacations they'd never taken. For hobbies they'd given up. For the retirement they'd stopped dreaming about. My father was shaking now. He asked me why I was doing this. I told him it was because they were my parents. Because despite everything, despite the favoritism and the comparisons and the constant feeling of being second best, they'd raised me. They'd fed me and clothed me and put a roof over my head. They'd given me opportunities, even if they'd given my brother more. And because I could. Because what was the point of chasing money if you couldn't use it to take care of the people who mattered? My mother was openly sobbing now. She stood up and came around the table, pulling me into a hug so tight I could barely breathe. She kept saying she was sorry, over and over. Sorry for not seeing. Sorry for not understanding. Sorry for making me feel less than. My father joined us. For the first time in probably 20 years, my father hugged me. Really hugged me. Not the awkward shoulder pat thing we usually did, but an actual embrace. My uncle tried to say something, tried to make a joke to break the tension, but my aunt shut him down with a look that could have melted steel. She told him he'd said enough for one evening. My brother sat frozen in his chair. His wife was still crying, but now she was reading through the trust documents, her hands trembling. She looked at me and mouthed a thank you that I knew came from somewhere deep and genuine. But my brother looked like his entire world had just shifted on its axis. The golden child who'd always been the favorite, who'd always been the one everyone gathered around, was suddenly sitting in my shadow. He finally spoke. He asked if I'd done this just to show him up, to prove I was better. I looked at him directly. I told him I didn't do this for him at all. I did it for our parents. I did it because they deserved to enjoy the last decades of their lives without financial stress crushing them. I did it because their grandson had mentioned wanting to be a doctor but worrying about student loans, and their granddaughter had talked about art school like it was an impossible dream. I told him I did it because family isn't about who shows up for Sunday dinner. It's about who shows up when it matters. And maybe I hadn't been here for the small moments, but I was here for this one. This moment that would change everything for all of them. The dinner continued, but everything had changed. The dynamic had shifted so fundamentally that you could almost see the air rearranging itself around us. My uncle didn't make any more jokes. My parents kept looking at me like they were seeing me for the first time. My brother's wife kept glancing between her husband and me, like she was recalculating everything she thought she knew. The rest of the evening was awkward. People didn't know how to act around me anymore. I wasn't the disappointment they could dismiss. I wasn't the punchline to their jokes about family values versus career ambition. I was something else entirely now, and they didn't have a script for it. When I was leaving, my mother walked me to the door. She held both my hands and looked me in the eyes. She told me she'd been wrong. So wrong. About everything. About what mattered. About who I was. About what success looked like. I told her I knew. I'd always known. But I'd also learned something important over the years. Their approval wasn't what drove me. It wasn't why I worked hard or why I succeeded. I did those things for myself. Because I wanted to prove to myself that I could. She asked if I could forgive her. I told her there was nothing to forgive. We were family. Family was messy and complicated and sometimes unfair. But at the end of the day, we were still family. She hugged me again, and this time I felt something I hadn't felt from her in years. Pride. She was proud of me. Finally. Update 1. I didn't expect this to blow up the way it did. I also didn't expect what happened 3 days after Christmas. My brother called me. We hadn't spoken since dinner, and honestly, I wasn't sure we would. The conversation started awkward. He thanked me for the trust fund for his kids. He said his wife hadn't stopped talking about it, making plans for their education, crying happy tears every time she thought about the opportunities they'd have. Then he got quiet. He admitted something I never expected to hear. He said he'd always resented me. Not because I left or because I was successful, but because I had the courage to leave. He'd always wanted more than this town, more than the life everyone expected him to live. But he was the good son, the one who stayed, the one who did what was expected. And somewhere along the way, that became his entire identity. He wasn't living his life. He was living the life everyone else wanted for him. He had the wife, the kids, the house close to mom and dad. He showed up for every dinner, every holiday, every family obligation. And he was miserable. He'd convinced himself that I was the selfish one to make himself feel better about his own choices. If I was the villain in the story, then he was the hero. Simple. But seeing what I'd done for our parents, seeing the freedom I'd bought them, made him realize something. I hadn't abandoned the family. I'd just lived my life on my own terms. And in the end, I'd been able to give them something he never could because I'd made different choices. He asked me how I did it. How I had the guts to disappoint everyone and not let it destroy me. I told him the truth. It nearly did destroy me. Those first few years after I left were brutal. Every phone call home was a reminder that I wasn't measuring up. Every holiday I missed was another mark against me. Every family gathering I attended was an exercise in feeling inadequate. But at some point, I realized I had a choice. I could spend my life trying to be who they wanted me to be and end up resentful and unfulfilled. Or I could be who I actually was and deal with their disappointment. Neither option was perfect. Both had costs, but only one let me sleep at night. He went quiet for a long time. Then he told me his daughter had asked him something last week. She'd asked him if he was happy, just like that, out of nowhere. She was 7 years old, and she'd looked at him with those big eyes and asked if he was happy. And he couldn't answer her. He'd frozen, changed the subject. But the question had been eating at him ever since. I didn't know what to say to that. There wasn't a right answer. He had kids, a mortgage, responsibilities. He couldn't just blow up his life because he was having a midlife crisis at 32. But I told him he also couldn't keep living like this. Resentment was poison. It would seep into everything. His marriage, his relationship with his kids, his health. He needed to figure out what would make him happy and find a way to move toward it, even if it was just small steps. Update 2. 2 weeks after that conversation, my father had a heart attack. Minor, thankfully. He was going to be fine. But it shook everyone. I flew back immediately. When I got to the hospital, my brother was already there. So was my mother. My father was asleep, tubes and monitors attached to him, looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen him. My mother grabbed my hand when I walked in. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The fear in her eyes said everything. We sat there for hours, the three of us. At some point, my brother said he'd been thinking about what could have happened. If Dad had died. If this had been worse. He said he'd realized he'd spent so much time trying to be the good son that he'd forgotten to actually have a relationship with our father. He couldn't remember the last real conversation they'd had. Not about the weather or the game or what needed fixing around the house. A real conversation. About life. About dreams. About anything that mattered. I admitted I couldn't either. I'd been so focused on proving myself, on building my career and my life, that I'd let the relationship atrophy. We talked on holidays. We exchanged pleasantries. But I couldn't tell you what made my father happy, or what he was afraid of, or what he wanted from the years he had left. My mother started crying. She said she'd done this to us. She and Dad had created this competition between us. This dynamic where one son was good and one was disappointing. And in the process, they'd lost both of us. We were both so busy playing the roles they'd assigned that none of us were actually connecting. When my father woke up, the first thing he did was ask if we were all there. My mother confirmed we were. All of us. He asked us to come closer. His voice was weak, but his eyes were clear. He told us he'd been thinking while he was lying there. About what mattered. About what he'd done wrong. About what he wanted to say while he still could. He apologized. To both of us. For the favoritism. For the comparisons. For making us feel like we had to compete for his love. He said he'd been raised in a family where love was conditional, where you had to earn approval. And he'd repeated that pattern without even realizing it. He told me he was proud of me, not because of the money or the mortgage or the trust funds, but because I'd had the courage to be myself, to build the life I wanted instead of the life he'd expected. Then he turned to my brother. He told him he was proud of him too, but he also told him something I wasn't expecting. He said he could see the unhappiness in him, had been seeing it for years, and he was sorry for that too. Sorry for putting so much pressure on him to be the good son that he'd trapped him in a life he never really chose. My brother started crying. Big, gasping sobs. He admitted he didn't know how to be anything else. This was all he knew. This was who he was. My father told him it was never too late to figure out who you really are. He should know. He was lying in a hospital bed at 63, just now realizing he'd wasted decades caring about things that didn't matter. Update 3. It's been 4 months since Christmas dinner. A lot has changed. My father is doing well. He's on medication and going to cardiac rehab. He's also taken up painting, of all things. Terrible paintings. Absolutely awful. But he loves it. My mother says he spends hours out in the garage with his easel, just happy. The monthly stipend I set up has meant they could both retire early. My father left his job 2 weeks ago. My mother is planning to leave hers in the summer. They're talking about traveling. About seeing things they've only seen in pictures. About actually living instead of just surviving. My brother made some changes too. He didn't blow up his life, but he did make some moves. He started taking online classes. Accounting. Something he'd always been interested in but never pursued because it wasn't practical, wasn't what he was supposed to do. He's talking about eventually shifting careers, maybe starting his own small firm. His wife is supportive. Excited, even. She told me privately that she'd been worried about him for years, but didn't know how to help. The trust fund for the kids has changed things for them too. His daughter is taking piano lessons now. His son joined a robotics club. Small things. but they're exploring interests without the constant anxiety about cost. And my brother is encouraging them in a way I never saw our parents encourage us. As for me, I'm thinking about moving back. Not to my hometown, but closer. Maybe an hour away instead of 3 states. I realized something through all of this. I didn't leave because I hated it here. I left because I needed to become my own person. But that work is done now. I know who I am. I don't need the distance anymore. And I miss them. I actually miss my family. Not the family we were, with all the dysfunction and favoritism and unspoken resentment, but the family we're becoming. The one that's learning to be honest, to be vulnerable, to actually care about each other instead of just performing our roles. My uncle, by the way, never apologized. He hasn't said a word to me since Christmas. My aunt told me he's embarrassed, doesn't know how to walk back what he said. I'm not holding my breath. Some people can't admit when they're wrong. That's their burden to carry, not mine. I went to Sunday dinner last week. First time in probably 5 years. It was strange. Good strange. We actually talked. About real things. My father showed me his paintings. My mother talked about the trip to Ireland she's planning. My brother told me about his classes. His kids showed me their latest projects. Nobody mentioned the mortgage. Nobody brought up the trust funds. Nobody treated me like the prodigal son returning. I was just there. Part of the family. Finally, at the end of the night, as I was leaving, my mother pulled me aside. She told me she'd been thinking about that Christmas dinner. About the moment I slid that folder across the table. She said she used to wonder what it would take for them to really see me. To understand what I'd accomplished and who I'd become. Turned out it took a paid-off mortgage and a folder full of financial documents. She laughed when she said it, but there was sadness there too. Regret. I told her what mattered wasn't how long it took. What mattered was that they saw me now. Really saw me. And I saw them too. Not as the parents who disappointed me or favored my brother or failed to understand. Just as people. Flawed people doing their best. People I loved despite everything. She hugged me tight and told me to come back soon. Not for an obligation. Not for a holiday. Just because I wanted to. I told her I would. And I meant it.